Chapter 5. Opioids. 5.1 The evolution of opioid use. Opioids have a long history that dates back to ancient times. The earliest known use of the opium poppy was by Sumerians around 3400 BC, who referred to it as the joy plant. Over the centuries, the use of opioids has evolved significantly through various cultures and contexts, leading to both medicinal and non-medicinal uses. Opioid compounds are derived from the resin of the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, and have played a considerable role in the management of pain and various other medical conditions. Historically, opioids were utilized for their therapeutic properties, with opium being a common remedy for pain, dysentery, and coughs in ancient civilizations such as Egypt, Greece, and Rome. During these times, there was limited understanding of addiction or the long-term effects of opioid use. This allowed for a relatively liberal use of these compounds, making them accessible to the general public. The medical and recreational use of opioids was largely undifferentiated until much later. The spread of opium through trade routes expanded its use to Asia, where it became a prominent feature of social and cultural activities, especially in China. In the 19th century, the British East India Company exported opium on a massive scale to China, leading to widespread addiction and subsequent historic conflicts known as the Opium Wars. These events underscored the addictive potential of opioids and the socio-political impacts that could follow widespread dependency. The isolation of morphine from opium in 1803 by German pharmacist Friedrich Sertiner marked a significant development in the evolution of opioids. Named after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams, morphine was more potent than raw opium and became widely used for pain relief, especially in military conflicts such as the American Civil War. The use of morphine brought about the first opioid addiction crisis on a large scale in the United States, exposing the need for regulation and understanding of drug dependency. The invention of the hypodermic needle in the mid-19th century was another catalyst for the spread of opioid use. This made the administration of opioids more efficient and allowed for better management of pain. However, it also facilitated the abuse of opioids, as the intensity and rapid onset of effects when injected led to higher rates of addiction. This period saw the beginning of the linkage between medical use of opioids and the development of substance abuse disorders. The early 20th century brought about several legislative actions aimed at controlling opioid use. The Hague Opium Convention of 1912 was the first international agreement focused on the problem of drug abuse. In the United States, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 was passed to regulate and tax the production, importation, and distribution of opiates. These measures represented the growing recognition of the need for legal frameworks to manage the risks of opioid use. In the quest for less addictive analgesics, chemists developed heroin from morphine, mistakenly believing that heroin would be less habit-forming. Marketed by Bayer as a cough suppressant in 1898, heroin's potent effects quickly led to abuse and serious problems of addiction. By the 1920s, the U.S. had banned the sale, importation, and manufacture of heroin. This shift reflected a deeper understanding of opioids as potentially dangerous substances when not properly controlled. Through the 20th century, scientific advancements continued to reshape our understanding and use of opioids. The discovery of endogenous opioid receptors and endorphins in the human body during the 1970s illuminated the neurochemical pathways through which opioids exert their effects, offering insights into pain management and the mechanisms of addiction. These advances positioned opioids as critical tools for acute and chronic pain control, but also brought to the fore the balance between therapeutic benefit and the risk of abuse. In recent decades, the prescription opioid crisis has highlighted the complexities involved in opioid use and regulation. The introduction of products like OxyContin in the 1990s was accompanied by aggressive marketing and assurances of safety and low addiction risk, which later proved to be incorrect. This has led to widespread misuse, addiction, and overdose deaths, prompting a reevaluation of how opioids are prescribed and the implementation of strategies to prevent abuse while managing pain properly. Today, the evolution of opioid use continues with a greater emphasis on understanding the balance between effective pain management and the prevention of substance abuse. Policies and guidelines for opioid prescribing have become stricter, and there are new initiatives for education about the risks of opioids. Additionally, there is a push for the development and use of alternative pain management strategies that might be able to mitigate the risks associated with opioid use. The history of opioids is a testament to both their therapeutic power and their potential for causing harm. Emphasizing safety in their use, recognizing the signs of dependence, and understanding the socio-cultural implications are crucial steps towards better managing the benefits and risks associated with opioid use. This complex history serves as a backdrop for ongoing efforts to improve pain management while reducing the negative impacts of opioid misuse and addiction. 5.2 Opioids, the social epidemic. Opioid misuse has rapidly evolved into a major public health issue, often referred to as the opioid epidemic. Opioids are a class of drugs that include the illegal drug heroin, synthetic opioids such as fentanyl, and pain relievers available by prescription, such as oxycodone, hydrocodone, codeine, morphine, and others. These substances are medically prescribed for the management of pain. However, their misuse can lead to serious health consequences, including addiction, overdose, and death. In recent years, an alarming increase in opioid-related overdose deaths has highlighted the severity of the social crisis. The addictive quality of opioids is largely responsible for their misuse and the subsequent public health emergency. The prevalence of opioid prescriptions as a pain management solution has significantly contributed to the epidemic. Opioids are effective in reducing the perception of pain, and physicians began prescribing them more frequently in the 1990s, in part encouraged by assurances from pharmaceutical companies that patients would not become addicted to prescription opioid pain relievers. However, this increase in prescriptions led to widespread diversion and misuse of these medications before it became clear that these medications could indeed be highly addictive. The availability of prescription opioids has therefore been identified as a gateway to opioid addiction, including the transition to more dangerous substances like heroin. Heroin, an illegal opioid, has seen a resurgence in use as prescription opioids become less accessible due to tighter regulations and awareness of the risk of addiction. Heroin is often cheaper and more obtainable than prescription opioids, which has pushed some individuals dependent on prescription opioids to turn to heroin as an alternative. This switch is particularly dangerous due to the inconsistency in potency, the presence of contaminants, and the risk of encountering potent synthetic opioids such as fentanyl, which has been linked to a rise in overdose fatalities. Thus, efforts to control prescription opioid abuse have inadvertently contributed to an upsurge in the use of illicit opioids. Fentanyl and other synthetic opioids have exacerbated the opioid crisis significantly. Fentanyl, for instance, is up to 50 times more potent than heroin and 100 times more potent than morphine, making it extremely dangerous, particularly when used unknowingly. Synthetic opioids can be mixed with heroin by dealers, often without the user's knowledge, leading to a higher potential for overdose. The potency and unpredictability of synthetic opioids pose one of the greatest risks in the current opioid epidemic, resulting in a dramatic increase in overdose deaths. The social impact of the opioid epidemic is multidimensional, affecting individuals, families, and communities. Opioid addiction can lead to unemployment, family breakdown, and increased crime rates, as those affected may turn to illegal activities to support their addiction. The long-term health consequences can include liver disease, brain damage, and increased risk of infectious diseases such as HIV and hepatitis C from needle sharing. The social stigma associated with drug addiction often prevents individuals from seeking help, reinforcing the cycle of misuse and addiction. The economic burden of the opioid epidemic is considerable, with costs arising from healthcare, lost productivity, addiction treatment, and criminal justice implications. The healthcare costs are driven by the need for emergency care services for overdoses, increased hospital stays, and the treatment of opioid-related health conditions. Expenditures associated with law enforcement and court proceedings for drug-related crimes add to the financial strain. Moreover, there is an economic impact related to lost productivity in the workforce due to addiction and overdose deaths. Prevention and education are crucial in combating the opioid epidemic. Efforts to educate the public, prescribers, and patients about the risks associated with opioids are needed to reduce the number of individuals who become addicted. Prevention strategies include prescribing guidelines, monitoring programs to identify suspicious patterns of opioid use, and regulatory measures to control the dispensation of opioid prescriptions. By implementing preventative measures, the goal is to reduce the incidence of opioid addiction and curtail the initial entry into opioid misuse. Treatment for opioid addiction is multifaceted, ranging from medication-assisted treatments (MAT) with drugs like methadone, buprenorphine, or naltrexone to counseling and behavioral therapies. MAT has been shown to decrease opioid use, opioid-related overdose deaths, criminal activity, and infectious disease transmission. However, access to such treatments is often limited by availability, cost, and social stigma. There is a vital need for widespread access to effective and compassionate treatment options for individuals struggling with opioid addiction. Government and public health responses have played a pivotal role in addressing the opioid crisis. This includes the enactment of policies to restrict the prescribing of opioids, increase transparency in the pharmaceutical industry, and promote the development and distribution of naloxone, a life-saving medication that can reverse the effects of an opioid overdose. Additionally, support for research into pain management alternatives that are less addictive than opioids could reduce reliance on these drugs. These responses are critical to managing and eventually overcoming the epidemic. Lastly, community-based initiatives such as drug take-back events, peer support groups, and outreach programs are integral to dealing with the opioid epidemic at a local level. These initiatives focus on preventing addiction, providing education, and supporting those in recovery. By fostering a community approach to combating opioid misuse, individuals can receive the support and resources necessary to fight addiction. Recovery is not just about overcoming physical dependence, it is also about building a supportive network and enabling individuals to reintegrate into society as productive and healthy citizens. 5.3 Opioids and the Brain, a Psychological View. Opioids are a class of drugs naturally found in the opium poppy plant. Some prescription opioids are made from the plant directly, and others are synthesized by scientists in labs using the same chemical structure. Opioids are commonly prescribed for pain relief because they contain chemicals that relax the body and can relieve severe pain. These drugs range from legal prescriptions like morphine, codeine, and oxycodone to illicit substances such as heroin. Our focus here is to explore how opioids interact with the brain from a psychological perspective. When opioids enter the body, they travel through the bloodstream to the brain. There, they attach to specific proteins known as opioid receptors, which are found on the surface of brain cells. These receptors are part of the larger endogenous opioid system, which includes 3 types of receptors: mu, delta, and kappa. Activation of these receptors has different psychological effects, including pain relief, pleasure, and relaxation. It's primarily the mu receptors that are involved in opioid drug effects and abuse. Opioids mimic the body's natural pain-relieving compounds, known as endorphins, by binding to and activating the opioid receptors. This binding dampens the perception of pain even to the point of euphoria, which is a substantial aspect of opioid drugs. When opioids bind to the mu receptors, they can block pain signals sent from the body through the spinal cord to the brain. This is why they are so effective as painkillers. However, this blocking of pain signals is accompanied by a sense of calm and pleasure because the action in the reward regions of the brain is also increased, particularly in the nucleus accumbens. This increase in reward activity in the brain is part of what contributes to the psychological aspects of opioid addiction. The intense feeling of euphoria or high that comes from opioids can create a powerful psychological incentive to continue using the drug. The human brain is wired to repeat behaviors that it finds pleasurable or rewarding, which is a basic principle of psychology known as positive reinforcement. With repeated use, the brain's reward system becomes skewed, and opioids are required for an individual to feel normal. This process contributes to the psychological dependence on the drugs. Apart from the reward system, opioids also affect the brain's limbic system, which controls emotions. This can result in mood changes, such as feelings of tranquility or drowsiness, which further complicate the psychological impact of these drugs. The limbic system is significantly involved in developing an emotional response to different stimuli, including stress, and opioids modulate this response, often resulting in a temporary easing of anxiety and stress. Tolerance is another critical aspect of opioid use from a psychological standpoint. Tolerance occurs when a person's reaction to a drug decreases over time, so they need larger doses of the drug to achieve the same effect. This can lead to a pattern of increased use and might pave the way to overdose risks. The psychological pursuit of the initial euphoric experience often drives this spiral, leading to addiction, a chronic, relapsing disorder characterized by compulsive drug seeking, continued use despite negative consequences, and long-lasting changes in the brain. Withdrawal symptoms further contribute to the psychological grip of opioids. When the drug use is stopped, the individual may experience a range of symptoms that can be quite severe. These symptoms can include anxiety, irritability, insomnia, muscle pain, and cravings, which provide a psychological push toward relapse. This withdrawal is a reflection of the body trying to rebalance its chemistry without the influence of opioids. Psychological interventions often need to address these symptoms to increase the chances of successful long-term cessation. Craving is an intense desire to use opioids and is often described by patients as being overwhelming and uncontrollable. Cravings can be triggered by exposure to drug cues, such as seeing needles or spoons, being in places where the individual once took drugs, or seeing others use drugs. From a psychological perspective, cravings can also be triggered by emotions or stress. The brain associates the use of opioids with relief from these negative feelings, further strengthening the connection between drug use and emotional self-regulation. Long-term opioid use can lead to depression and anxiety disorders. This may be due in part to the way opioids can dull the emotional responses of the user over time. Even after stopping the use of opioids, individuals may suffer from these mental health issues, which makes treating opioid addiction complex. Psychological care in these instances is as crucial as managing the physical aspects of withdrawal and addiction. It's necessary to address these co-occurring disorders for effective treatment and sustainable recovery. Finally, opioid use has significant neurobiological implications that result in psychological effects. The brain can undergo structural and functional changes due to prolonged opioid abuse. Such changes may involve areas critical for decision-making, behavior control, and responses to stress. The prefrontal cortex, which is involved in executive function and impulse control, is particularly vulnerable. Reduced prefrontal cortex function can lead to impaired judgment and decision-making, which may perpetuate the cycle of addiction. Psychological interventions aimed at addressing these brain changes are essential pieces of the puzzle for providing effective treatment and promoting recovery. The psychological view of opioids and the brain encompasses a wide range of factors, including the reward system, emotional regulation, tolerance, withdrawal, cravings, and neurobiological changes. Understanding these aspects is crucial for developing effective treatment strategies for opioid addiction and for educating both healthcare professionals and the public about the risks and effects of opioid use. The aim of psychological interventions is always to mitigate these effects and support individuals in their journey to recovery, helping them to regain control over their lives and health. 5.4 Traditional uses of opioids across cultures. Opioids are a class of drugs derived from or structurally similar to the natural compounds found in the resin of the poppy plant, Papaver somniferum. Historically, opioids have been used for thousands of years for their analgesic, pain relief, and euphoric properties, with their use deeply woven into the fabric of various cultures. Their traditional uses across different societies reflect both medicinal and ritualistic applications, portraying a rich tapestry of ethnopharmacology that predates contemporary medical practices. In the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, as far back as 3400 BC, the Sumerians referred to the poppy plant as hul-gil, translated to the plant of joy. This recognition signals one of the earliest known uses of the opium poppy. The Sumerians passed their knowledge to the Assyrians, who then passed it on to the Babylonians and the Egyptians. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical document dating to approximately 1500 BC, includes explicit mention of opium as a form of pain relief, indicative of its importance in early therapeutic practices. The ancient Greeks also employed opium in various forms. The Greek god of dreams Morpheus lends his name to the term morphine, an active alkaloid found in opium. The consumption of opium was common both for its analgesic properties and as a sleep aid. The physician Hippocrates, sometimes called the father of medicine, acknowledged the usefulness of the poppy juice for its sedative properties and for the relief of pain in diseases and during surgery, underlining its integration into early medical care. The use of opium continued throughout the Roman Empire, where it was commonly used for pain relief and as a means to alleviate diarrhea. Galen, a prominent Greek physician, surgeon, and philosopher in the Roman Empire, prescribed opium extensively and documented its effectiveness. Despite its widespread medicinal application, it should also be noted that there were ancients who warned of opium's potential for misuse and dependency, although this was not thoroughly understood at the time. In Asia, particularly in India and China, the use of opium has a complex and enduring history. In traditional Ayurvedic medicine, one of the oldest holistic healing systems in the world, opium was used in a controlled and regulated manner. Its properties for alleviating dysentery, managing pain during surgical procedures, and for inducing sleep were well recognized. In Chinese medicine, opium was administered to relieve pain, and also as a therapeutic component in the treatment of emotional distress. Among indigenous cultures across various regions, such as in the Americas and Africa, while there is less explicit historical documentation of opium per se, there was a broad recognition and use of native plants with opioid-like effects for both medicine and ceremony. These practices, passed down through generations, emphasize the importance of these substances within spiritual and healing contexts. For example, in the peyote ceremonies of some Native American tribes, although peyote is not an opioid, it illustrates a parallel in the ritualistic use of psychoactive substances in traditional cultures. In the Islamic Golden Age, the influential medical scholar Avicenna, also known as Ibn Sina, who wrote the medical text, the Canon of Medicine, included opium among the substances utilized for an array of therapeutic applications. His observations contributed to a nuanced understanding of opium's dual nature, as a potent medicine with potential risks. Trade routes facilitated the spread of opium use from the Middle East into Europe, where it became ingrained in medicinal practices during the medieval period. During the Renaissance and into the Victorian era, laudanum, a tincture of opium mixed with alcohol, became a commonplace remedy prescribed liberally for a vast range of ailments, including cough, diarrhea, menstrual cramps, and chronic pain. It was so widely used that it became an early example of a household drug, accessible to adults and even to children, which underscores the complex and often overlooked relationship society has had with opioids throughout history. In the 19th century, the isolation of morphine from opium by the German pharmacist Friedrich Serturner marked a significant change in the use of opioids. With a more potent and easily administered form available, its use in pain management became more refined. However, this transition also heralded the beginning of the modern issues of opioid addiction and abuse, as the potency of these isolated compounds also meant that they had a higher potential for dependence. Given the broad and historical utilization of opium and its derivatives across cultures, it is evident that opioids have served significant roles in the evolution of medicine and in the socio-religious practices of many societies. The therapeutic benefit of pain relief that they offer has been an indispensable tool in the physician's repertoire for centuries. Nonetheless, as illustrated, the history of opioids is also a cautionary tale, reminding us of the importance of balance between use and abuse and the need for attentive and regulated medicinal application. Presently, this historical perspective informs our current understanding and prescriptive practices surrounding opioids, emphasizing an approach that is both mindful of their potential for harm and appreciative of their therapeutic potential. 5.5 Philosophical debates on pain and opioids. The relationship between pain and opioids is a complex one that intersects with philosophical questions about the nature of suffering, ethics of pain management, and societal impacts. At the core of these debates is the understanding of pain as a deeply subjective experience, one that challenges our ability to define, measure, and manage it accurately. Pain, unlike other sensory experiences, carries a significant affective component. It is not only sensed, but it is also felt emotionally. This subjective quality makes pain challenging to assess and treat, because people experience and report pain differently. The philosophical debate around opioids and pain management often centers on the question of whether pain should be treated as a primary concern in medicine, or whether it should be secondary to tackling the underlying causes of pain. On one hand, pain is a warning signal that indicates harm or potential harm to the body, suggesting that it should not be dulled without first addressing its source. On the other hand, pain can be debilitating, impeding an individual's ability to function and significantly diminishing their quality of life. In such instances, pain management, potentially including the use of opioids, may be necessary to restore functionality and well-being. The ethical considerations surrounding opioid prescriptions are another critical aspect of the philosophical debate. On one end, there is the duty to alleviate suffering, a fundamental principle in medical ethics. Opioids, when prescribed and used correctly, can provide significant relief to individuals experiencing acute or chronic pain. However, the potential for addiction, dependency, and the societal impact of opioid misuse balances this duty. This dynamic creates a moral dilemma for prescribers who must carefully consider the benefits of opioid pain relief against the risks of contributing to the broader public health crisis of opioid addiction. The concept of autonomy in patient care is closely linked to the ethical considerations of opioids in pain management. Patients have the right to make informed decisions about their treatment, including the choice to use or refuse opioids for pain management. However, the addictive potential of opioids complicates this autonomy, as dependency may undermine an individual's ability to make free choices. Further, social and economic factors may influence a patient's decision-making process, adding another layer to the discussion of autonomy in the context of opioid use. Another philosophical debate concerns the justice model in providing access to pain management, including opioids. Disparities in healthcare can lead to uneven access to pain relief, which raises questions about the equitable distribution of medical resources. Some populations may be under-prescribed pain management options due to biases or lack of resources, while others may be over-prescribed opioids, potentially due to commercial influences or inadequate training in pain management. This issue raises ethical questions about how to ensure fair access to appropriate pain relief for all individuals, regardless of their socioeconomic background or race. The tension between the individual experience of pain and the societal implications of opioid use raises a philosophical question about the nature of responsibility. To what extent should individuals be held accountable for their use or misuse of opioids versus the extent to which society, through its medical institutions, regulations, and cultural norms, bears responsibility for enabling, preventing, or managing opioid addiction? The debate often involves considering personal responsibility in the context of broader socio-political structures that influence the availability and perception of opioids. Questions of what constitutes a good life and the role of pain in human experience further complicate the philosophy of pain management. Some argue that the pursuit of a life without any pain is unrealistic and potentially harmful, as it may lead to an over-reliance on medications like opioids. Conversely, it is contended that minimizing avoidable suffering is a mark of an advanced society. This balance between acceptance of pain as a part of life and the relentless quest to alleviate pain shapes the ideologies surrounding pain management policies and practices. The idea of beneficence in medicine, or the obligation to help others and promote well-being, is closely intertwined with the use of opioids. While opioids can play a role in fulfilling this obligation by reducing pain, there is also a risk of causing harm through the adverse effects of opioids, including addiction and overdose. This duality presents an ongoing challenge for healthcare professionals, who must weigh the likelihood of benefit against the risk of harm when considering opioid therapy for pain management. In recent years, the concept of opioid stewardship has gained attention, which incorporates many of these philosophical debates. Opioid stewardship programs aim to promote the responsible use of opioids by establishing guidelines that balance the need for pain management with the necessity to prevent misuse and addiction. Such programs often involve multimodal pain management strategies, education for prescribers and patients, and monitoring and regulation mechanisms to ensure opioids are used safely and effectively. The philosophical debates on pain and opioids touch on various aspects of human experience, medical practice, and societal values. These debates are unlikely to be resolved conclusively due to the complexities involved in balancing the ethical, social, and individual factors at play. As knowledge about pain and its mechanisms continue to evolve, so too will the discussions about the role of opioids in pain management. It remains essential for healthcare professionals, patients, and society as a whole to engage in these discussions to navigate the challenges of opioid use thoughtfully and responsibly. 5.6 Understanding opioids through chemistry. Opioids are a class of drugs that are well known for their potent analgesic, pain-relieving properties. The term encompasses a range of substances, including morphine, heroin, oxycodone, and synthetic opioids like fentanyl. The chemical structure of opioids is central to their function and impact on the human body. At a basic level, opioids are composed of a core structure called the morphinin skeleton, which is responsible for their pain-relieving effects. The variations in the chemical structure that extend from this skeleton differentiate one opioid from another and influence their potency, duration of action, and potential for addiction and adverse effects. Opioids exert their effects primarily by binding to and activating opioid receptors in the central nervous system, CNS. These receptors are part of a larger family of G-protein coupled receptors and are classified into three major types, mu, delta, and kappa. Each type of receptor plays a different role in the body's response to opioids. For instance, activation of mu opioid receptors is primarily associated with analgesia and the reward system, which can lead to the addictive properties of opioids. Activation can also result in respiratory depression, which is the primary cause of mortality in opioid overdose. The mu opioid receptor, MOR, is the most relevant when discussing opioid analgesics. Chemically, opioids mimic the body's natural endorphins, which are peptides that also bind to these receptors. The interaction of opioids with MOR can be characterized by the receptor's affinity for the drug, how well the drug binds, and the intrinsic activity, how well the drug activates the receptor after binding. These attributes are determined by the precise shape and electronic properties of the opioid molecule and the receptor, and explain why different opioid substances have different effects and potencies. The chemistry of opioids also explains their routes of administration. For instance, morphine and many other opioids are polar substances, which makes them poorly absorbable through the gastrointestinal tract and more effectively administered through intravenous injection. On the other hand, modifications that enhance lipophilicity, such as those in fentanyl, allow for effective transdermal, through-the-skin delivery via patches. This advantageously provides a slow and steady release of the drug, making it suitable for chronic pain management. Synthetic opioids, such as fentanyl, are designed to be more potent than naturally occurring ones. A slight chemical modification can result in a compound that is hundreds of times more potent than morphine. These modifications are intended to affect the pharmacokinetics of the drug, how the body absorbs, distributes, metabolizes, and excretes it. Such chemical changes can lead to benefits such as reduced drug doses, quicker onset of action, or longer-lasting effects. However, they also carry increased risks of overdose and addiction because smaller amounts result in powerful effects that can easily surpass the body's ability to handle them safely. The development of opioid tolerance and dependence is also related to chemistry, particularly to the drug's effect on receptor downregulation. With continued exposure to opioids, the CNS can make adaptive changes, such as reducing the number of opioid receptors or their responsiveness. This means that higher doses of the drug are required to achieve the same level of effect, resulting in a cycle of increased use and putting users at risk for overdose. Chemical strategies aim to circumvent these issues, such as the development of opioid agonists, antagonists, or partial agonists that may provide analgesia with reduced risk of tolerance and dependence. Opioid formulations may include other chemicals to deter abuse. For instance, many prescription opioids are formulated with naloxone, an opioid antagonist that precipitates withdrawal in the presence of opioid dependence but is inactive when taken orally as directed. This is to discourage tampering and intravenous use. Chemistry also offers insight into the metabolism of opioids, explaining differences in how individuals process drugs and the implications for both efficacy and the risk of adverse effects. The active metabolites of certain opioids can have their own effects and risks, as is the case with morphine, which is metabolized to morphine 6-glucuronide, a compound that can accumulate and cause toxicity in patients with renal impairment. The stability and shelf life of opioid medications are further determined by their chemical properties. Factors such as exposure to light, temperature, and moisture can lead to the degradation of opioids, potentially reducing their efficacy or leading to the production of harmful byproducts. Understanding the chemistry of opioids is crucial to the development of appropriate packaging, storage guidelines, and expiration dates. Furthermore, the interaction between opioids and other molecular entities in the body, such as other drugs or dietary compounds, can lead to complex chemical interactions impacting their safety and effectiveness. This is often the result of competition for metabolic enzymes or alteration of drug transport across biological membranes. Lastly, the fight against opioid abuse and overdose requires chemical knowledge as well. The development of drugs like naloxone, which can reverse the effects of opioid overdose, relies on an understanding of how opioids interact with receptors. Naloxone acts by competitively binding to opioid receptors without activating them, effectively blocking the action of opioids. Its chemical structure allows it a higher affinity for the opioid receptors than many opioids, but without activating them. This can rapidly reverse the life-threatening respiratory depression that often occurs during an overdose. Chemical innovation continues to be essential in creating better antidotes and treatments for opioid addiction, providing hope for more effective medical interventions in the future. The chemistry of opioids is intricate and influences every aspect of their use, from how they relieve pain to how they can be abused and lead to addiction. This understanding is vital to informing safer prescribing practices, designing drugs with fewer adverse effects, and combating the opioid crisis through chemical and pharmaceutical advancement. Investing in ongoing research to deepen our chemical knowledge of opioids will play a fundamental role in improving patient care and addressing public health concerns related to opioid misuse and dependence. 5.7 Opioids and the human body. Opioids exert their effects on the body by interacting with the nervous system. These substances act particularly on opioid receptors, which are part of the larger family of G-protein-coupled receptors. These receptors are distributed throughout the central and peripheral nervous system, as well as within the tissues of the gastrointestinal tract. When opioids bind to these receptors, they can influence the perception of pain, emotional response, and reward processing. The primary effect of opioid interaction with these receptors is analgesia, or pain relief, often accompanied by a sense of euphoria, which makes them profoundly effective as painkillers, but also highly susceptible to abuse. When an opioid molecule binds to an opioid receptor, it triggers a series of cellular events that culminate in the inhibition of neurotransmitter release. Specifically, the binding of an opioid to its receptor activates a G protein, which in turn inhibits adenylate cyclase. This reduction in adenylate cyclase activity decreases the conversion of adenosine triphosphate, ATP, to cyclic adenosine monophosphate, CAMP. The reduced levels of CAMP then diminish the release of neurotransmitters such as substance P, glutamate, and acetylcholine, which are involved in transmitting pain signals. As a result, the nerve cells become less responsive to pain stimuli, thus providing relief to the individual. Apart from their analgesic effect, opioids can influence mood and emotions due to their action on the limbic system, the part of the brain involved in emotion regulation. By binding to receptors in this area, opioids can induce feelings of pleasure and relaxation, but they can also lead to mood swings, anxiety, and depression with prolonged use. The initial pleasurable effects often decline over time with regular use, as the body develops tolerance, leading to increased dosages to achieve the same effect in raising the risk of addiction. Opioids also affect the autonomic nervous system, which controls involuntary bodily functions such as heart rate, respiration, and digestion. They can induce a state of calm and slow down physiological processes, potentially leading to constipation, reduced heart rate, and respiratory depression. The latter is particularly dangerous, as it can result in insufficient ventilation and oxygenation of the blood, leading to situations like hypoxia, which can be life-threatening. It is this risk of respiratory depression that poses one of the greatest dangers with opioid overdose. The ability of opioids to induce tolerance and physical dependence distinguishes them from many other therapeutic agents. Tolerance refers to the phenomenon where increasingly larger doses of the drug are required to achieve the same effect previously obtained with smaller doses. Dependence, on the other hand, is a state where the body adapts to the presence of the drug, and its absence brings about a range of physiological and emotional withdrawal symptoms. These can include agitation, muscle aches, gastrointestinal distress, and severe cravings. The endocrine system, which regulates hormonal balance, is not immune to the effects of opioids either. Chronic opioid use can disrupt the normal production and regulation of several hormones. This dysregulation can lead to a variety of symptoms including reduced libido, infertility, fatigue, and depression. Alterations in hormone levels can have significant long-term health implications and impact an individual's quality of life. Repeated exposure to opioids also affects the body's pain regulation system itself. Over time, opioids can lead to a condition known as opioid-induced hyperalgesia, where the individual becomes more sensitive to pain. This paradoxical reaction is poorly understood, but it challenges the management of pain, as standard doses of opioids may become less effective or even exacerbate pain symptoms. It exemplifies the complexities of opioid therapy and its potential to complicate the very issue it is meant to treat. One of the most critical aspects of opioids' interaction with the human body is the development of addiction. Addiction to opioids is a chronic relapsing disorder characterized by compulsive drug seeking, continued use despite harmful consequences, and long-lasting changes in the brain. The process of addiction involves a series of adaptations at the molecular and cellular levels that affect the function of reward-related areas of the brain. These changes can persist even after the cessation of drug use, highlighting the need for long-term treatment and monitoring of individuals recovering from opioid addiction. In addition to the central nervous system effects, opioids also affect the immune system. Research suggests that opioids may suppress immune function, though the clinical significance of this effect remains a topic of investigation. This immunosuppressive action could theoretically increase an individual's susceptibility to infection. However, the implications of this effect need to be more fully understood. The complexity and variability of immune responses to opioids demand careful observation and further study. Finally, it is crucial to recognize that the impact of opioids on the human body is not uniform across all individuals. Variations in genetics, the presence of other medical conditions, concurrent use of other drugs, and personal history can all influence how a person responds to these substances. This variability underscores the necessity of a personalized approach in the management of pain and the treatment of opioid disorders. Healthcare providers must weigh the benefits of opioid treatments against potential risks and consider alternative therapies or adjunctive treatments as appropriate. Opioids are powerful substances with a broad range of effects on the human body, encompassing the nervous, endocrine, and immune systems. They can provide significant pain relief, but come with the risk of tolerance, dependence, and addiction, as well as other potential adverse effects. Effective opioid therapy requires a comprehensive understanding of these effects, monitoring for signs of misuse or physiological changes, and the consideration of individual patient factors. The medical community continues to strive for a balanced approach that maximizes relief while minimizing harm in the context of opioid use. 5.8 Stories of Addiction and Recovery. The opioid crisis represents a significant public health challenge with deep and far-reaching impacts on individuals, families, and communities. Opioids include a range of substances, from prescription medications like oxycodone and hydrocodone to illicit drugs like heroin and synthetically produced fentanyl. Addiction to these substances can have devastating consequences. However, through understanding personal struggles, we glean insights into the complexities of addiction and the potential pathways to recovery. One powerful illustration comes from the story of Michael, a former college athlete who became addicted to painkillers following a sports injury. Initially prescribed to manage pain, Michael found himself unable to stop using the medication even after his injury healed. His experience with opioids started as a medically sanctioned treatment, but quickly spiraled into dependency. Over time, the need to satisfy cravings led him to doctor shop for prescriptions before eventually turning to cheaper and more readily available heroin. Michael's story is not unique. Many people find themselves unintentionally hooked on opioids after legitimate medical use. As tolerance builds, they require higher doses to achieve the same effect, often leading to physical and psychological dependence. For some, once prescription opioids become too difficult to obtain, heroin offers a more accessible and inexpensive alternative, though it comes with increased risks of overdose and exposure to infectious diseases if injected. Conversely, Sarah's encounter with opioids began recreationally with friends at a party. What started as an experiment turned into a pattern of regular use. As her tolerance grew, so did her need for stronger opioids to reach the desired euphoria. The relentless pursuit of this high disrupted her relationships, career, and health, illustrating how recreational use can evolve into addiction. Despite the different initial exposures to opioids, the end result mirrored that of many others, a life centered around substance use. At the core of many addiction stories is the monumental struggle to balance the intense cravings against the desire to quit. Withdrawal symptoms can be excruciating, with users experiencing severe pain, gastrointestinal distress, and intense mood swings. For Jack, a middle-aged man with a decade-long struggle with opioid addiction, the fear of withdrawal kept him from seeking help. It was only after an overdose scare that he reached out for support, moving onto a path toward recovery. Recovery stories often highlight the role of comprehensive treatment approaches. Medication-assisted treatment, MAT, combining pharmaceutical intervention with counseling and behavioral therapies, played a pivotal role in Jack's recovery. Access to medications such as methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone can alleviate withdrawal symptoms and cravings, allowing individuals to engage more fully in their recovery process. Therapy helped Jack understand the root causes of his addiction, develop coping strategies, and rebuild his life. Peer support groups are also instrumental in the recovery journey. For Angela, attending meetings with others who shared similar experiences with opioid addiction provided a sense of community and understanding that she was not alone. Support groups offer a space where individuals can share their struggles and successes, giving and receiving advice, and finding strength in the collective experience of recovery. The role of family in navigating addiction and recovery cannot be understated. Emily's family initially struggled to understand her addiction, often reacting with frustration and anger. However, through education and family therapy, they learned how to provide supportive and compassionate care. Families can be critical allies in the recovery process, offering love, understanding, and accountability, but they must also have access to resources that help them cope with the challenges of having a loved one with an addiction. Lapses and relapses are a common part of the recovery process. For some, like Tom, the journey to sobriety includes multiple attempts at treatment and moments of relapse. It's important to recognize that addiction is a chronic disease, and like other chronic diseases, it can require ongoing management. Relapse does not signify failure, but rather indicates a need to readjust the treatment approach. A relapse can provide valuable lessons and an opportunity to strengthen the recovery plan. The importance of holistic services in the treatment of opioid addiction should also be acknowledged. Addressing only the physical aspects of addiction without considering mental health, social environment, and economic factors can limit recovery success. Holistic services may include mental health care, vocational training, legal assistance, and housing support, and can greatly enhance the likelihood of sustained recovery. Finally, prevention is a key element in the response to the opioid epidemic. Prevention efforts focus on reducing the initial exposure to opioids, enhancing prescription practices, and raising public awareness about the risks of opioid use. These campaigns aim to change social norms, educate on safe medication use, and manage pain in ways that minimize the potential for addiction. Through prevention, education, treatment, and support, there are opportunities to reduce the impact of opioids and foster stories of recovery and hope. 5.9 Opioids in healthcare. Opioids have a long history in healthcare, primarily for their analgesic properties, meaning their ability to relieve pain. They are naturally derived from the opium poppy, or can be synthetically manufactured. These drugs function by binding to specific proteins known as opioid receptors, which are located on nerve cells in the brain, spinal cord, GI tract, and other organs. When opioids adhere to these receptors, they can effectively block pain signals sent from the body through the spinal cord to the brain. Due to their efficacy in mitigating severe acute and chronic pain, opioids are a cornerstone in pain management protocols, especially for cancer-related pain, post-surgery pain, and end-of-life care. In the context of acute pain, such as the pain following surgical procedures, opioids are typically prescribed for short-term use. Their administration is carefully managed to minimize the risk of addiction and other potential side effects. The goal is to use the lowest effective dose for the shortest period necessary to control the pain. Healthcare providers closely monitor patients for signs of sufficient pain control and any adverse reactions. In such scenarios, opioid use is generally considered safe when prescribed and taken as directed, though the risks and benefits must be weighed carefully, particularly in individuals with a history of substance abuse. For chronic pain, the use of opioids is more complex due to the risk of developing tolerance, dependence, and potentially addiction. Long-term opioid therapy must be approached with caution and involves ongoing assessment by healthcare providers. They evaluate the effectiveness of pain relief against the potential for harmful consequences. When opioids are prescribed for chronic conditions, it typically follows an assessment that non-opioid treatments have been insufficient. Agreements between the patient and the healthcare provider regarding the use of the drugs, sometimes called opioid treatment agreements, are common to establish expectations and responsibilities. Healthcare providers are also aware of the risks associated with opioid use, including constipation, nausea, drowsiness, and respiratory depression. Constipation is particularly problematic in patients using opioids over an extended period, and often requires a comprehensive bowel regimen to prevent severe complications. Respiratory depression is the most serious risk and can be life-threatening. Therefore, opioids must be dosed judiciously, and patients monitored closely, especially when using extended-release or long-acting formulations. Opioid use disorder is a significant concern in the healthcare system due to the addictive properties of these drugs. To mitigate this risk, healthcare professionals are trained to identify signs of opioid misuse, such as seeking prescriptions from multiple providers, taking higher doses than prescribed, or using opioids for non-prescribed purposes. Screening tools and protocols are in place in many healthcare settings to identify patients at risk for opioid misuse. If misuse is identified, healthcare providers may refer patients to specialized treatment for substance use disorders. Balanced against the risk of misuse and addiction is the undeniable reality that opioids are sometimes the most effective treatment for alleviating severe pain. To optimize safe use, efforts are made to tailor the opioid regimen to the individual needs of the patient. This includes selecting the appropriate opioid and dosage, considering the patient's medical history, current medications, and potential for drug interactions. Clinicians also consider the route of administration, with options including oral, transdermal, and intravenous administration, offering different onset times and duration of effect. Palliative care and end-of-life care are other areas where opioids are indispensable in healthcare. These fields focus on providing relief from the symptoms and stress of a serious illness, where the goal is to improve the quality of life for both the patient and the family. Opioids are often used to control pain and dyspnea, difficulty breathing, which can significantly affect a person's comfort levels. In these sensitive situations, the priority is on symptom control rather than concerns about long-term dependency or addiction. In response to the opioid crisis and the high rates of addiction and overdose fatalities, healthcare systems and governments have implemented strategies to ensure responsible opioid prescribing. Prescription drug monitoring programs, PDMPs, are databases used to track prescribing and dispensing of controlled substances, including opioids. This enables healthcare providers to review a patient's prescription history before prescribing an opioid, which helps reduce the risk of overprescribing and misuse. To promote the responsible use of opioids in healthcare, there are also guidelines for prescribing opioids for chronic pain developed by entities such as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC. These guidelines provide recommendations on when to initiate or continue opioids for chronic pain, opioid selection and dosage, duration of treatment follow-up, and when to discontinue opioid treatment. Such guidelines encourage the use of alternative therapies and the importance of patient education regarding the risks and benefits of opioid use. Opioids play a critical role in healthcare, particularly in the management of acute and chronic pain, as well as in palliative and end-of-life care. Despite their effectiveness, the associated risks require meticulous management and monitoring to prevent misuse, addiction, and other adverse outcomes. A multifaceted approach that includes patient education, risk assessment tools, careful prescribing practices, regular monitoring, and collaboration between healthcare providers is essential to maximize positive outcomes and minimize harm. As the healthcare community continues to respond to the challenges presented by opioid use, it is hoped that patients can continue to receive the pain relief they need, while minimizing the potential for opioid-related harms. 5.10 Policies and laws surrounding opioids. The use, distribution, and manufacture of opioids are heavily regulated by a combination of international agreements, national laws, and local policies. These regulations aim to balance the need for legitimate medical access to opioid medications for pain control with the necessity to prevent abuse, addiction, and illegal trafficking. Understanding the policies and laws surrounding opioids is crucial for healthcare providers, law enforcement, policymakers, and the general public. Internationally, opioids are regulated through treaties such as the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961, which was a pivotal agreement under the United Nations auspices. This treaty classified drugs according to their therapeutic usefulness and potential for abuse, imposing strict controls on the production, trade, and distribution of opioids. Subsequent international agreements have also shaped opioid policies, particularly emphasizing the need for cooperation in combating drug trafficking while ensuring the availability of narcotics for medical and scientific purposes. In the United States, the Controlled Substances Act, CSA, of 1970 is the primary federal law governing the regulation of opioids. The CSA categorizes drugs into 5 schedules based on their potential for abuse, their accepted medical use, and the extent of their potential for addiction or dependency. Opioids, depending on their potency and abuse potential, are scheduled from 2 to V, with Schedule 2 containing potent opioids like oxycodone and fentanyl, which have a high potential for abuse but are still available for medical use. The Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, is a critical regulator and enforcer of the CSA. It monitors the flow of opioid medications from manufacturing to dispensation, and it takes action against illegal prescribing practices, diversion, and distribution of illicit opioids. To ensure compliance, healthcare providers must register with the DEA to legally prescribe opioids, maintaining proper records and adhering to strict prescribing guidelines. The Prescription Drug Monitoring Programs, PDMPs, are state-run electronic databases used in the United States to track the prescribing and dispensing of opioids to patients. These programs are designed to help identify and prevent drug abuse and diversion, while providing critical data for public health initiatives and law enforcement. PDMPs are a significant component of opioid policies, contributing to safe prescribing practices and facilitating the early detection of problematic patterns of usage. In response to the opioid epidemic, many jurisdictions have implemented laws to increase access to treatment for opioid addiction and to broaden the availability of naloxone, a life-saving medication that can reverse opioid overdoses. Such measures include Good Samaritan laws that provide legal protection to those who assist in an overdose situation, and laws that allow pharmacists to dispense naloxone without an individual prescription. Opioid prescribing guidelines have been established by various health organizations to ensure that opioids are prescribed safely and appropriately. For example, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, released guidelines for prescribing opioids for chronic pain in 2016. These guidelines offer recommendations for the assessment of pain, decision-making for opioid initiation, dosage determination, and risk mitigation strategies, with a strong emphasis on patient education and monitoring. The national opioid policy landscape is frequently updated with initiatives focused on prescribing practices and law enforcement efforts against illicit drugs. Initiatives like the National Prescription Drug Take Back Day aim to reduce the supply of unused or expired medications that could be misused. These efforts support a broader strategy to reduce the impact of opioid abuse on communities while also promoting environmental protection by providing safe disposal options. Legal consequences pertaining to opioid misuse vary significantly, including penalties for illegal possession, distribution, and trafficking. These can range from fines and mandatory drug treatment programs to lengthy imprisonment, depending on the nature of the offense and the quantity of drugs involved. The judicial system plays a fundamental role in delineating between drug abuse as a public health issue and as a criminal justice concern. Many countries enforce strict import and export controls for opioids, with regulations on documentation and security measures to prevent diversions to illicit markets. Governments also work with the International Narcotics Control Board, INCB, which monitors international trade in opioids to ensure compliance with international treaties and to prevent the accumulation of excessive stock, which could be prone to diversion. Healthcare policy advancements continue to shape the way opioid treatments are provided and managed. For instance, innovations in drug formulations, such as abuse-deterrent opioids that are more challenging to manipulate for non-medical use, are part of ongoing efforts to mitigate the risks associated with opioid medications. Regulatory agencies often have specific approval processes for these formulations, highlighting the dynamic nature of opioid policies as the scientific and medical understanding of these drugs evolves. Finally, it is essential to acknowledge the real-world implications of these policies and laws for patients requiring pain relief. While stringent regulations aim to abate the opioid crisis, they also need to consider the legitimate needs of patients. Thus, Policymakers continue to strive for an equilibrium that prevents abuse and addiction while enabling access to those in need of effective pain management. The policies and laws surrounding opioids are intricate, designed to navigate the complex challenge of providing access to necessary medications while preventing their misuse. These regulations undergo constant modification in response to emerging data, public health trends, and the shifting landscapes of medical practice and illicit drug use. As such, staying informed and vigilant in adhering to these laws and policies is imperative for all stakeholders involved in the management and control of opioid use.